The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like leather and desperation. I had sat in rooms like this one hundreds of times over the past 3 decades, but today felt different. Today, the man at the head of the table, the man who had called me a charity case at his daughter's wedding rehearsal dinner, was about to learn something that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. My name is Daniel. I'm 61 years old. I drive a 2009 Chevy Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a passenger side mirror held on with electrical tape. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Millbrook, Ohio, the same house my wife Sandra and I bought in 1999 for $187,000. The gutters need cleaning. The back porch has a board that's been soft for 2 years. My neighbors assume I'm a retired logistics manager, which is technically not wrong because that's what I told them when we moved in. What I never told anyone outside of my attorney and one accountant who has worked with me for 22 years is that I own 44% of Caldwell Commercial Properties, a real estate development company headquartered in Columbus with assets currently valued at just over $1.1 billion. My father-in-law, Gerald Caldwell, built that company from a single strip mall in 1981. He is 73 years old, sharp as he ever was, and he has despised me since the first night Sandra brought me home to meet him in the spring of 1994. I was 30 years old then. I showed up in a clean flannel shirt and work boots because I had come straight from a job site. I was working in warehouse operations at the time, managing freight logistics for a mid-sized distribution company out of Dayton. I made $47,000 a year. Sandra was $27 a year. Sandra was 27, a commercial lease coordinator who had just started working for her father's company. We had been seeing each other for 4 months, and I was already certain she was the only woman I wanted to spend my life with. Gerald took one look at my boots and made his assessment. He was cordial. The way a man is cordial when he has already decided the answer is no. He asked me about my family. I told him my father had worked the line at a GM plant for 31 years before it closed. He nodded the way people nod when they're doing arithmetic in their heads. He asked me where I saw myself in 10 years. I told him I had some investments I was working on. He smiled at that, not a kind smile. Sandra squeezed my hand under the table. What Gerald did not know, what he had no reason to know, was that I had been buying real estate quietly since I was 24 years old. I had started small, a duplex in Kettering, then a 4-unit in Springfield, then a small commercial space in Xenia that I leased to a dry cleaner and a nail salon. By the time I met Sandra, I had 14 properties and a growing sense of how money actually moved through real estate markets. I read everything. I drove every neighborhood on weekends. I lived on almost nothing and reinvested everything. I was not rich when I met Sandra, but I was building something, slowly and deliberately, the way my father had taught me to do anything worth doing. I never told her the full picture. Not because I wanted to deceive her, I want to make that clear, because this is the part people misunderstand, but because I had watched money destroy relationships my entire life. My father's brother borrowed $14,000 from my parents in 1979, and it ended a 30-year friendship between them. 3 of my college friends went into business together, and 2 of them stopped speaking to the third within 4 years. I had seen what happened when people found out you had more than they expected. The dynamic shifted. Everything shifted. I wanted Sandra to love me for exactly what she saw, because I was proud of what I had built, and I didn't want it complicated by anything other than who I actually was. So I kept my investments separate. She knew I had rental properties. She knew I was careful with money and that we lived comfortably. She did not know the scope of it. We married in 1996. Gerald gave Sandra a beautiful rehearsal dinner, hired a string quartet, and toasted to her happiness in a way that very carefully never mentioned my name. At the wedding itself, he shook my hand and told me he hoped I understood what kind of responsibility I had taken on. I thanked him and meant it. We bought our house in 1999 and we were happy. Genuinely, quietly, completely happy. Sandra made friends with the neighbors. Our son Michael was born in 2001. She planted a vegetable garden in the backyard and grew tomatoes that were better than anything you could buy. On Sunday morning, she made biscuits from scratch, and we sat at the kitchen table with the radio on low. And it was the best part of every week for 20 years. Michael is 23 now. He graduated last spring with a degree in civil engineering from Ohio State and just started his second year at a firm in Columbus. He is the best thing I have ever been part of. During those years, I continued building. Quietly. Deliberately. I used LLCs with names that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know to look. I hired good attorneys. I filed everything correctly. I bought commercial properties in secondary markets, Akron, Fort Wayne, Lexington, Lansing, and leased them to regional retailers and medical offices and distribution companies. I was careful, and I was patient, and I was good at it. The connection to Caldwell Commercial Properties began in 2003. Gerald had expanded aggressively in the late 90s and found himself over-leveraged when the commercial market softened. He needed capital. He brought in 3 outside investors at the time, selling minority stakes to generate liquidity. 2 of those investors were conventional real estate funds. The third was a holding company called Meridian Property Group LLC, registered in Delaware, which had purchased a 44% stake for $18.4 million. Meridian Property Group was mine. I want to be honest about why I did it this way. I knew it was Gerald's company. I knew Sandra worked there. I had no intention of interfering with operations, no interest in inserting myself into Gerald's world. I was an investor, and he was running a good business, and the fundamentals were strong. I structured it specifically so that my identity would not be disclosed unless I chose to disclose it, or unless a direct transfer of ownership was involved. My attorney reviewed everything. It was entirely legal. It was also entirely deliberate. For 12 years, Gerald ran his company without knowing who Meridian Property Group was. He knew it was a private holding entity. He had received the capital injection, used it to stabilize the business, and grown Caldwell Commercial significantly over the following decade. By 2015, the company was worth over $600 million. Gerald had bought back one of the original outside investors, but Meridian's stake remained. During those 12 years, Gerald continued to treat me the way a man treats a stray cat that his daughter insists on feeding. He was never cruel. He was something worse. He was dismissive. At family Christmas, he asked Michael about school, and asked Sandra about work, and asked me how the Bengals looked this year. He referred to me at a company anniversary party to another guest. As Sandra's husband, he does something with trucks. I was standing 6 feet away. Sandra saw it. She apologized for him more times than I could count. She told me he was a product of a different generation, that he didn't know how to relate to men who hadn't built something he could see. I told her it was fine. Most of the time it was fine. Some of the time in the car on the way home, it was not fine. But I kept my mouth shut, because I understood something Gerald didn't. The account I was keeping wasn't a grudge. It was patience. The situation changed in January of this year. Gerald had been approached by a development group out of Phoenix called Stonegate Capital Partners. They wanted to acquire a controlling interest in Caldwell Commercial. Specifically, they wanted 51%, which would effectively give them operational control of the company. Gerald had been in conversations with them for several months. The offer was significant. Stonegate was willing to pay a substantial premium above assessed value. The problem, from Stonegate's perspective, was Meridian. To complete their acquisition, they needed to either purchase Meridian's 44% stake or obtain Meridian's agreement not to exercise blocking rights that were written into the original 2003 shareholder agreement. Without Meridian's cooperation, the deal could not close. My attorney called me on a Tuesday morning in early February. He told me Gerald's legal team had been trying to locate Meridian's principals for 6 weeks. They had found the Delaware registration, but the beneficial ownership was shielded through a legitimate trust structure. They were running out of options. My attorney asked me what I wanted to do. I sat with that question for a long time. That same week, Gerald called Sandra. He told her he had a significant business development underway and that he needed to speak with her about her future at the company. He also mentioned, in passing, that he was planning to use some of the proceeds from the potential sale to set up trust funds for his grandchildren, Sandra's children, which meant Michael, contingent on the deal closing. He presented it as a generous gesture. It may have been, it was also pressure. Sandra mentioned it to me over dinner. She was careful about how she said it, the way she had always been careful when the subject of her father came up between us. She said she thought it might be a good opportunity. She said she hoped the deal would work out. I looked at her across the table and thought about all the Sunday mornings and all the biscuits in the vegetable garden and the way she had squeezed my hand at that dinner in 1994. I told her I thought she should stay focused on what made her happy at work and that everything would sort itself out. Then I called my attorney back and told him to reach out to Gerald's legal team. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon at Caldwell Commercial's headquarters in Columbus. Gerald's attorney, a man named Warren, called my attorney the night before and asked who would be representing Meridian. My attorney told him the principal would be attending personally. I drove to Columbus in the Silverado. I wore a dark navy sport coat over a gray shirt, no tie. I parked in the public garage across the street. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like leather and desperation. Gerald was already seated when I was shown in. He had 2 attorneys with him and his VP of Finance, a man named Paul I had met at company events over the years. Gerald looked up when I walked through the door, and for a moment his expression was the expression of a man who assumes there has been an administrative error. "Daniel," he said. Just my name. Flat. Like a question that didn't know how to form itself. I sat down across from him. My attorney sat beside me. "Gerald," I said. Warren cleared his throat and began explaining the purpose of the meeting, describing Meridian's position in the shareholder structure, walking through the blocking rights. Gerald was very still. He was looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've had in your house for 20 years and suddenly noticed is actually valuable. Warren asked me if I was prepared to discuss Meridian's position on the proposed Stonegate acquisition. I said I was. I told him that Meridian would not be supporting the Stonegate transaction. I explained that I had reviewed the proposed terms and that the offer, while financially significant, was structured in a way that would result in operational changes I believed were contrary to the long-term health of the company. I said that Caldwell Commercial had been built by someone who understood regional markets in ways that a Phoenix-based acquisition group would not, and that the employees and tenants who depended on the company deserved continuity of leadership. Paul, the VP of Finance, was taking notes. He had stopped taking notes. Gerald's attorney Warren started to speak, and Gerald held up one hand. "How long?" Gerald said. "The initial investment was in 2003, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I watched him do the arithmetic, the same arithmetic he had done in his head 30 years ago at his dinner table, and I watched the answer land differently this time. "Sandra doesn't know," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said. "Why?" he said. And this was the moment I had thought about, in the way you think about something for a long time without exactly knowing you're doing it. I had imagined versions of this conversation where I said something sharp, something that would require him to sit with the weight of 30 years of casual dismissal. I had imagined versions where I was generous, where I let him understand without having it stated explicitly. What I said was the truth. Because Sandra married me for the right reasons, I said, and I wanted to make sure that was always true, and I wanted to be someone worth marrying for those reasons. The money was never the point. Gerald looked at me for a long time. There was something happening in his face that I had never seen there before. Not embarrassment exactly. Something older and more complicated than embarrassment. Warren started talking again about contingency options, about revised deal structures, about whether Meridian might consider a partial sale. I let him talk. I answered the legal questions. The meeting lasted another 45 minutes. When it was over and we were standing, Gerald asked me to stay for a moment after the others left. His attorneys exchanged a look and walked out. My attorney looked at me and I nodded. Gerald and I stood on opposite sides of the conference table. 42 floors below us, Columbus moved through its afternoon, indifferent to the two of us. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I had also imagined this part. You don't have to." I started. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I was wrong about you for 30 years and I knew it before today, if I'm honest. But I told myself a story and I kept telling it because it was easier than admitting I was wrong." He paused. "I want you to know that I know that." I nodded. "What happens now?" he said. "With Meridian." I told him I had no intention of disrupting his operations. I told him I had been a silent investor for 22 years and I was comfortable remaining a silent investor. I told him I would work with his team to formalize the blocking position against Stonegate in whatever documentation they needed, and that beyond that I expected nothing. He asked me if I wanted a seat on the board. I told him no. He asked me if I wanted him to talk to Sandra. I told him that was my conversation to have, and that I would have it on my own time. He put out his hand. I shook it. It was the first real handshake we had ever had. I drove home in the Silverado. I stopped at a gas station outside of Reynoldsburg and bought a large coffee and sat in the parking lot for a while with the windows down. It was a cold February afternoon and the light was already going gray. I thought about my father, who had worked the GM line for 31 years and never once complained about it. I thought about the duplex in Kettering and the way I had felt the first time I signed a lease as a landlord. I thought about Sandra, in a white dress in 1996, saying words she meant. I called her from the parking lot. I told her there was something I needed to tell her and that it was important, and that I needed her to listen to all of it before she responded. She said okay, and I could hear in her voice that she was already a little afraid, the way you're afraid when someone says those words. I told her everything. The properties, the LLCs, the timeline, Meridian, her father's company, the meeting that afternoon. I talked for almost 20 minutes. She didn't speak. When I finished, there was silence on the line long enough that I said her name. "I'm here," she said. Another silence. "The gutters," she said. "What? You've been telling me for 2 years you couldn't afford to have someone come do the gutters." I started to explain and she made a sound that I realized after a moment was laughing. "Daniel," she said, "you absolute idiot." I laughed too. I couldn't help it. She was quiet again for a moment, and then she said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" I told her honestly that I wasn't sure. That I had intended to someday, but that I had never found the right time, and eventually it had become something I had let go too long and didn't know how to bring back. I told her I was sorry for that. I told her the reason I had kept it the way I had was because I needed to know, and needed her to know, that the life we had built together was built on what we actually were to each other, and not on what I had in an account somewhere. She was quiet again. "I knew you had money," she said. "I'm not an idiot. You drive a 20-year-old truck, and you never stressed about anything. I knew something was there." "I know," I said. "I didn't know about my father's company." "No." "How do you feel about that?" she asked. I thought about it. "I feel like it's been between us long enough," I said. "I feel like I'm glad it's over." She exhaled slowly. "My father called me this afternoon," she said. "About an hour ago. He said he had something he needed to talk to me about in person. He didn't say what." "I know what it is," I said. "I figured," she said. We were quiet together on the phone for a moment, in the way you can only be quiet with someone you've been married to for a long time. The comfortable kind of quiet that doesn't need anything from you. "Come home," she said. "I'll make dinner." I finished my coffee and pulled out of the parking lot. Sandra and I talked for 4 hours that night after dinner. There were points where she was frustrated with me. Genuinely frustrated, the honest kind, not performance. And I sat with that and answered her questions and didn't try to manage it. She asked me about specific decisions I had made, specific moments where I could have told her and didn't, and she deserved honest answers to all of them. By the end of the night, she understood. not forgave. Exactly. Or maybe forgave is the right word, and accepted is a better one. She understood what I had been trying to protect, and she understood the ways it had also not been fair to her, and we held both of those things at the same time, the way married people learn to hold contradictions. Sandra and her father had lunch 2 weeks later. She told me afterward that he had apologized to her. Not for specific things. Gerald was not built for specific apologies, but a general acknowledgement that he had not seen me clearly and had been unfair in ways he regretted. She said he looked tired. She said she thought it had cost him something to say it. I don't know what Gerald Caldwell thinks of me now. I don't need to know. The Stonegate deal fell through. Gerald's team is in conversation with a regional group out of Indianapolis that has a better operational fit. I'm not involved in those discussions beyond being available through my attorney if my signature is required on anything. That's the relationship I want with that company. That's always been the relationship I wanted. Michael knows now. We told him over dinner last month. He asked me more questions about the business structure than about the family history, which is probably a good sign for his career in civil engineering. He shook his head a few times. At one point, he looked at the Silverado through the kitchen window and then looked back at me with an expression I will take to my grave. The gutters got done. I hired a company out of Canton, and they came on a Saturday, and Sandra stood in the backyard watching them work with her coffee, and a look on her face like she had won something. I don't know what a person is supposed to do at the end of a long secret. I don't think it leaves you the way you expect it to. The morning after I told Sandra everything, I woke up at 5:30 the way I always do, and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and the house felt exactly the same. Same table, same crack in the baseboard by the back door that I keep meaning to fix. Same light coming through the window over the sink. What I kept thinking about was something my father said to me when I was maybe 12 years old. We were fixing the chain on my bicycle, and he was explaining how to get the tension right, and he said, without looking up, that the whole secret to anything worth doing was that you had to be willing to work at it longer than anybody watching thought was reasonable. I thought about that a lot over the years. I thought about it in that parking lot outside Reynoldsburg with a gas station coffee going cold in my hand. I think he was right about the work. I think he was also right that eventually you have to put the tool down. The back porch board still needs fixing. Sandra reminded me about it on Sunday morning while we were having breakfast. I told her I'd get to it this weekend. She looked at me over her coffee. "You've been saying that for 3 years," she said. "I know," I said. "You could hire someone," she said. "I know," I said. "You're going to do it yourself." "Yes," I said. She shook her head, but she was smiling when she did it. The radio was on low. The coffee was good. Outside the window, the yard was still mostly brown from winter, but there were small green things coming up along the fence line where Sandra had planted bulbs back in October. It looked, from where I was sitting, like it was going to be a decent spring. I've been thinking about what my father told me when I was 12 years old, crouched over a bicycle chain in the driveway. He said the secret to anything worth doing is being willing to work at it longer than anybody watching thinks is reasonable. I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it now. What happened to me? What happened between me and my father-in-law over 30 years wasn't really about money. It was about the choices a person makes when no one is watching. Gerald saw a man in work boots and a flannel shirt and decided the story was finished before it started. I don't blame him entirely for that. We are all, at various points in our lives, guilty of reading the cover and skipping the pages. But the cost of that habit is real. It compounds quietly, the way debt does, until one Thursday afternoon in a conference room it comes due all at once. I spent decades building something in silence, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I had seen what happened when people built things loudly. The ones who announced every step rarely finished the climb. The ones who kept their heads down and kept moving. They were the ones still standing when the weather changed. Patience is not passivity. It is a discipline. It requires you to absorb a great deal of noise without letting it redirect you. The hardest part was never Gerald. The hardest part was knowing that Sandra deserved the full truth and choosing, year after year, to give her something less than that. I told myself I was protecting the integrity of what we had. That was partly true, but it was also partly a way of avoiding a difficult conversation, and I have to be honest about that. Good intentions do not automatically produce good outcomes. What a person does with the gap between their intentions and the actual effect of their choices. That's where character lives. When I finally told Sandra everything, she didn't fall apart, and she didn't forgive me instantly, and she didn't perform either reaction for my benefit. She sat with the truth and asked hard questions and expected real answers. That is what a person of genuine strength does. She had been building her own kind of patience for 30 years, absorbing her father's dismissiveness and her husband's silence, and she had done it without becoming bitter or small. I am more grateful for that than I know how to say. What I want anyone to take from this is something simple. The work you do when no one is applauding is not wasted. The restraint you practice when retaliation would be easy is not weakness. The life you build quietly, brick by brick, in the years when the people around you have already decided you are not worth watching, that life is the only one that actually belongs to you. Reputation is what others construct about you. Character is what you construct in the hours no one sees. Gerald and I are not close. I don't expect that to change dramatically, but we are honest with each other now, which is more than we ever were before, and that is worth something. Sandra and I had biscuits on Sunday, and the yard is starting to come back after winter, and Michael called from Columbus to ask about easement law, which I know nothing about but enjoyed pretending otherwise for 20 minutes. The back porch board is fixed. I did it myself on a Saturday, which is exactly the kind of man I am.